This is ContactTalkRadio.com. Consciousness in action. And you are taking action into your consciousness by tuning into Contact Talk Radio.
And on TuneIn.com, Ping.fm, and UpSnap Mobile.
Contact Talk Radio.
Welcome to Spiritual Psychic with Sara Wiseman, where you'll learn how to unlock the secrets of spiritual intuition and your own psychic gifts. Here's Sara.
Welcome everyone to Visionary Psychics. I'm Sara Wiseman, and I'm so happy to have with us here today MIRIAM Smith, who is one of the astrologers, or an astrological spiritual coach, that is in the Visionary Psychic group. So welcome, MIRIAM. I'm so happy to be with you here today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I came across you, actually, I have no idea how, but I know that before we started working together, and you've done some readings for me before, I discovered your blog, which is astounding. I think it's Fugitive Umbrellas. Is that correct?
Yeah, fugitiveumbrellas.com.
Yeah. So anybody looking around, looking for some extraordinary writing and some astrology thrown in, but that was what got me, like, who is this person? And then finding out you were a gifted astrologer as well. So I'd love to have you talk a little bit about kind of like what your approach is like. Like, astrology is a big field and people have different areas. What do you like to do, or how do you approach it?
Well, the way I, kind of look at my career is I consider myself a counseling astrologer. Now, most astrologers, of course, they do a lot of technical analytical work, but my focus is really on helping people. So just about, if you do read my blog, or if you talk to people I've worked with, I'm focused on what are you doing here in this incarnation, and what can you actually do in this physical realm to get to that point. I mean, that's not to say it's entirely material. Like, I am very interested in people's karma and in helping people, elevate themselves spiritually. But the reason that we have bodies and that we are bound to earth is because we're supposed to use that. And ultimately, you could use astrology to help people figure out how to do that with what they have right now. So one of the things, of course, I think with my approach too, is I love when people just let me discover who they are. And it's probably my favorite thing about being an astrologer is that you can read the classics, you can talk to other astrologers, you can read charts, but when you're actually working with a person, that's when you actually really understand astrology. What does that actually mean? As above, so below.
Yeah. Well, I know, and you and I have talked about this before, but like for me as a clairvoyant, like when someone comes to me, I'll get what I call a guiding vision, and then it's almost like I don't see a stack of dominoes, but it's almost like I see what's happening now and what's about to happen to some distant, near future. It just shows up, and it feels like with your approach to astrology, like you just look at the chart or whatever details, and it's like the puzzle is revealed. Is that sort of how you feel it works, or?
Kind of like when I look at a person's chart, I try to figure out who are they as a person, because nobody's really just the sum of all their parts. I think, most people have seen a natal chart, but that really is a dynamic, comprehensive blueprint of a person. But then there's that point where you're studying it and you're getting to know a person. You're getting to know what is good about them, what's lovable about them. And then it's almost as if like I'm walking in the dark and the exit to a maze is revealing itself. And I'm like, and then it just starts to fall into place. Okay, this is what's happening. This is how it makes sense. It is almost as if I'm walking with my eyes closed, through a maze, but I already can see the exit in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with little markers along the way.
Or like when Data's on like Star Trek and he's just suddenly able to put all the pieces together in a puzzle, or to put all the cards back in the slots when they're supposed to be at lightning speed, just because he's in that mode.
Yeah. When people ask you about something in their life and you can see from their chart that it's going to be really rocky, how do you approach that with them?
Well, I think that the first question, always be, why are you asking me this? And what is happening and what need do you have? Because nothing comes out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
And second, what is, wouldn't say like what is going on necessarily outside of you, but how do you feel about this right now? Because honestly, nobody ever calls me up and says, everything's great, I got nothing to complain about, let's just spend 2 hours together.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
every time it's something that's rocky. And the problem is almost every time it's not going to be a very easy solution. Mm-hmm. The good news is that almost everybody has, and I don't think I've ever read a chart where nobody doesn't have the talent or the skills or the agency to figure a way out, because, there can always be an obstacle, but every person is equipped with something to help them through.
Yeah. Do you believe, like you talked about karma before, and my version of karma, the definition I use is soul lessons learned over time. So it's not a curse from our ancestry. It's not a curse. And also over time, like maybe this lifetime we'll figure this soul lesson out. Perhaps it's going to take longer. Do you feel that like when people are facing obstacles or challenges that they're working through soul, what terms would you use for that idea?
With a lot of people, I will just use the term karma because it's easier. Like for you, I don't believe it's a cosmic quid pro quo. I don't believe that it's brownie points or that it's a punishment. And I don't think anyone should go about their life that way, because while you're still living, you're creating new karma and new situations and new things. And frankly, when we try to look at things outside of ourselves and talk about karma happening to other people or in other situations, we actually have no idea if that's
exactly. Yeah. And
we're even worse at deciding that for ourselves. So I do like to use the word karma because I also, in a sense, like to teach people that I think that we can be much more forgiving when it comes to talking about karma to ourselves, because we're really people trying to learn stuff with whatever we have at the moment, while also learning all the rest of the things. Life is like the first day of 9th grade, spiritually almost all the time.
Yes. And I'm wearing my plaid bell bottoms, which were not a good choice, but I loved them back then. Yeah, I think that's really true. This idea, like we are doing the best we can, and life is a learning experience, and it's just an experience that we're going through. Recently, I've just come through a fairly rocky period of time, and now the astrology has kind of shifted, and I can feel that more forward momentum, or more some releasing or some relief from a longer period. And like astrology can help us see, like, okay, it's really rough now, and around here it'll get easier. And sometimes just knowing we're going to have that little breather can be super useful. Yeah. When you look at what would you look at for somebody's main personality aspects? And I think, some of the people watching know this already, but some are kind of new to astrology. So just kind of brushing up on that for them.
So my method is to go around the zodiac. I like to use dispositor. So when I first look at a person's chart, I look at their ascendant, because that's usually what I'm going to meet first before I meet their sun. And I see what planet is ruling that ascendant. So let's say if you have Pisces rising, it would be Neptune. I go see where Neptune is, and I go see what is ruling Neptune. So if you have Neptune in Sagittarius, then that would be Jupiter. And I'd start to put together an idea of how does this person operate in the world. I would do the same thing for the sun. because like I said, nobody is just a sum of their parts. Nobody is like 12 little parts of their lives. Everybody is a dynamic, changing human being. And so I actually read the chart as if I'm just swirling around a circle.
Mhm.
And that way I don't get too caught on something. And then I think I get a really good comprehensive idea of who a person is, what they want and what they need. And I also find that it keeps me from getting stuck on something. It also helps me not, astrologers are people too, and you can make mistakes. You can be like, I'm totally right about something and just go half cocked in the wrong direction, which is unhelpful. But I also find out if it takes me through a person's entire chart, their entire personality, possibly their entire history, it's easier for me to actually love them. And when you love somebody, it's so much easier to actually get to know them.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't say like I'm not falling all over people when they meet me, but it's like when I'm ready to see them, I've gone through their chart enough to get a pretty comprehensive idea of their personality. So I'm really kind of happy and excited to see them and get to know them. And for them to tell me more about how those planets work in their life. And does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's like when you look at their chart, because you'll look at someone's chart before you meet with them in person, and it's like you're like, oh, you're so interesting, and look at this, and look at this, and you're like just looking at this very unique beat, because we're all so unique, even though we're all one, but you're just looking at this unique being and sort of rooting for them or celebrating like the things that they can have easier success with, and kind of lifting up the things that are more challenging for them. Yeah. When people do you ever meet people who their chart tells you one thing and then they show up and like that's not who's presenting? Does that happen? Okay.
Yeah, it does. I mean, sometimes what happens is that they're either they're not necessarily in touch with that energy, or did interpret it incorrectly. And the thing is, astrologers can be wrong. Part of the problem with a lot of astrological interpretations is that they're made by astrologers and not people in the real world, especially when it comes to vocation. And frankly, unfortunately, when it comes to relationship. What I do find though is that when I'm reading a chart, instead of analyzing a person as if they're a machine, I like to leave enough room for someone to start telling me who they are, because if there's things that happen in childhood, there's things about their family I may not necessarily know, there's things that they're going through that may make them emphasize different parts of their personality. But what I do find is that the things that I usually will pick up on that maybe they don't necessarily believe are true are things that do make sense to them in some way. But I have had a couple of instances where I've looked at somebody and I was like, this person has got to be, like this, but it turns out that's not who they present themselves to be. But deep down, that seed is still there. And if I'm lucky, if I have an opportunity, I like to pour some water on that seed and be like, yeah, you can be that awesome, crazy, dynamically creative person that you always were.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I know whenever I get a reading, astrological or a psychic reading, there's always something that I'm like, oh, no. And then I'll go back. And then the next day I'm like, nope, still it's a no. And then, a week later, oh, yeah, that was, yeah, that. And then that starts that whole inquiry of, okay, now I'm paying attention to this watered seed that I wasn't even, focused on or aware of. Yeah. I'm sure people ask you about romance. Do you make any judgment? Like, so you see, compatibilities or so forth, and do you make any judgment, or how do you approach, like, we're no longer in the time frame of forever and ever, one person, one lifetime. We may have lots of different relationships. What's your approach to, as people are asking you that question, how do you look at that?
Well, I think the truth is, if we look outside of what was considered the conventional norm, it was never really that way. There was always somebody, there was always the one that got away. There was always the relationship you couldn't have, or there was always like the spouse who died in the next relationship, or having to hide a secret affair. So, I mean, I think now this is something that people do get a chance to explore, because I don't believe in one soulmate forever. There are maybe a handful of people who might have that relationship, or they might have, I guess, the proverbial twin flame, but most of us have a whole set of soulmates.
Yeah.
And depending on who you meet depends on where you're at.
Yes.
And they're not always healthy for you either. I mean, sometimes you just got to learn some hard lessons, or you have to meet them and go like, I'm not going to let that bullet hit me. I'm totally.
Yeah. I see it and I avoid it. Oh, I'm so glad you said that. I don't really use that term twin flame, so I'm super aware of it, but that I hold that same idea of there's many soulmates. We may come across one and be with that person for a lifetime or not, but there's so many souls. How can there be, it just doesn't make sense. And in meeting people that are so interesting, and I think you could use that kind of soulmate idea for, maybe you have a soulmate career, or you have a soulmate country, or, it doesn't have to be a person. It could be a larger organization. Do you look at countries, or do you look at the astrology of countries? Is that something you do or are interested in?
I do look at locational astrology, and also what they call mundane astrology, which is of businesses and places. I definitely do look at the United States astrology. The United States is having their Pluto return right now, which is huge. But I also do relocation charts for people. I love helping people figure out where they should move.
Yeah.
And how moving can actually affect the expression of different parts of their personality or make it easier.
Yeah. I think people feel that they'll just go to places that it just feels like their heart home, and they can't quite, and if it's past life, or we don't know always why, but that's so interesting. You mentioned the Pluto return. I was just reading about that. So at the time of recording, we're in late 2021. Do you have any comments on Pluto return coming up, or anything to focus on?
So I've been working on this. I've been talking to a few other predictive astrologers about the reckoning that we think is coming. I don't mean that the fireballs are going to come down from the sky, or that it's going to be all chaos and mayhem, but Pluto is the planet of complete and absolute transformation. And when that transits through your chart, whatever house it is, and a house is an area of life, it will transform it completely to the point where it can never be what it was before. Most human beings don't live through a Pluto return, but it would force this country to really take a look at what it values, what's important to it, and where is it actually going, and also looking at issues of power. So we are going to either see very huge power shifts, or we're going to see a lot of people wasting a lot of energy and a lot of other things trying to keep the powers that be. As we did see through the pandemic, we had Pluto has been transiting through Capricorn, which is the sign of institutions, of hierarchy, of traditions of power. And Pluto has been effectively changing that for the whole 21st century. Right. So it did it before, during that revolution, when it started the American colonies. And now I have a sense that something's going to change. I don't think we're going to split up into other little countries, but I do think that something is going to be permanently different, and it's going to be big.
Yeah.
And I don't want to scare people, because I really don't. It could be,
well, So change is how things are, right? Like, so even if there's a big change, a little change is continuous. So since we can't stop anything, we can just relax and notice and watch and pay attention. Do you think, I've been looking with a great deal of interest about, like these kind of bands or striations of different, like, millennials, Gen Z, boomer, just the different age clusters. Um, I guess it feels like Gen Z is super important. At least that's what's in my awareness. Like, watch what they're doing and notice, because that's where the new ideas are coming from. And at some level, is when you're talking about Pluto in the US and things being different, does that come in? Do you look at generations like that astrologically, or how does that figure for you?
And I do. And I think one thing that I'm very much focused on is the fact that no matter what's happening, even if it's generational, everybody has control over what they do and how they choose to react to things. So this change could be totally awful, or it could be a totally amazing thing where people are like, let's harness this power, and do something wonderful. And the interesting thing about Gen Z is that they have a lot of this very hard Capricorn energy. A lot of their outer planets are there. And that's also a sign of restriction and waiting and earning your dues. Whereas, once Gen X invented the internet and the e-commerce and the whole in digital age, everyone just like gave them a pass forever and got off their back.
Yeah.
This Gen Z now they are facing all of that sort of Capricornian deprivation.
Right.
School is too expensive. They can't get jobs. They're going to be deeply in debt. They can't move out. And as we know, when we look at all revolutions, is that the people who are motivated to do things are the people that are starving.
Yeah.
And you can only frustrate these guys so much, because they're also they're going to be like the most highly educated group that we have, probably the most spiritually aware, probably the most tolerant and the most accepting of everyone else. And I think what we're going to end up seeing probably is we're not going to probably see like a student demonstration with communists in the street. We're probably going to see an implosion of all of these institutions that they just say, this doesn't work anymore, and we're not going to participate. And maybe, let's say the student loan crisis simply ends because these guys just say, you know what, we're just not going to pay. What are you going to do? Come after all of us?
Yeah, exactly.
I swear I will be right behind them. And that's what I figured. They might just be the silent revolution that's just like, no, we're just not going to do the thing and can't make us. So where are you going to get money and support? Oh, guess you didn't think of that.
Yeah, that is exactly what I've been, because as we're speaking, I'm preparing for my, I do a channeled receiving for the year ahead, but I don't use astrology. I just use the intuitive stuff that comes. And that's exactly, it's like, if all these structures are there and no one attends or no one supports, there's nothing to have a structure around. And so it's almost like we've been chipping away at, racial inequality, gender orientation. Like we've just been chipping away at all these forms of patriarchal inequality. And now these bigger things, like you're right, this is the group that's tolerant, spiritual, equal, has the technology to communicate with themselves as opposed to communicate in the old systems. And it's just going to be pretty interesting what happens. And if the leading is by group or if the leading is by individual, and I feel like we're coming to this place of leading from the group, like everyone, like the giant circle of humanity, and everyone has a say instead of one person in the castle, you do this and so forth.
And with Saturn now in Aquarius, which is the sign of, the collective, and Saturn of restriction, but also power and control, patriarchy, things like that, is moving back and forth in Uranus. Mm-hmm. It's the traditional ruler, but it tends to overthrow, tends to consolidate, and it does it quietly. It doesn't, Saturn is not like Uranus, like it's not big bang boom. It's like, I am slowly going to build this foundation. And I get that sense when I watch this transit, this sort of sense that that certain things are just sort of being allowed to erode because people are just sort of taking a big bits of sand each time, and they're doing it with people are complaining about things that are irrelevant, like the fact that they're not buying dryer sheets, or they're spending too much on coffee, and they're not looking that they're actually really kind of destroying this huge consumerist part of our culture that has been so spiritually detrimental to us. That's what they're actually doing. It doesn't matter if they're supposedly spending $7 on coffee or not. It's so, to me, I find that very interesting, because I think by the time that the whole culture looks at what Gen Z has actually done, they will feel blindsided, even though if you were paying attention,
you would,
they've been actually doing this the entire time. And I hope I'm still going to be alive for that. And cool enough to appreciate it, but I won't be
cool enough to be able to follow it. And I was just thinking, I was buying some oat milk, and I was just remembering how in the past, like way back at lunch, if you were a kid of my age way back, you would have to have cow's milk. You were required to have a little box of cow's milk. And that just seems to be kind of like completely off the table. Cow's milk doesn't agree with a lot of people. It's not really specifically about that, but about something that was so set in the culture. And now it's just like not even the leading thing. It's just probably a choice that's going out. So there's a lot of things, like you were saying, the eroding sand. And it's just it's becoming so commonplace that just everybody is kind of making their own decisions about things in retrospect aren't really that big a deal in the first place. The entire cafeteria table drinking all kinds of different milk. Why not? Do you see anything, one of these things that's kind of eroding away is what I tend to follow is a lot of like these reports on how people are not following the traditional religion that they were raised with as children. Have you noticed anything about, I guess, spirituality or people's spiritual practice in terms of an astrological trend? Is that something you've looked at or think about?
That's something I think about a lot. I mean, something that's happened to me personally, because I was raised in a very obsessively Catholic household, which really didn't jive with who I ever was. And I've had to, and you've actually helped me with this tremendously, is actually accepting who I am and that my intuition, and that the fact that I have a much different spiritual path. And I think especially as noticed with that Pluto moving through Capricorn, and not just here, but in so many, the whole world, that people are just like, this isn't working for us. I mean, if you think about it too, I mean, it's not just necessarily just because it doesn't accept everybody. And we're learning, like, you really don't have to conform, but there's a lot of it, there's just no social consequence to not doing it. Like, I'm an attorney full time, but I can be an astrologer, and I'm not going to lose my job or my license. In fact, a lot of my coworkers know I do this. And, and that's really, it would not have been that way 20 years ago.
Yes.
And I think it's just going to be, my hope and my vision is that it's going to be normalized, and we're going to kind of see so this is astrological, but it's also the vision I have as we start seeing the planets moving into Pisces, is that a kind of reawakening of the witches, of the medicine women, of not just our matriarchal ties to spirituality, but that we're all going, those of us who remember are going to be able to just be out, and those who are remembering now are going to be able to openly practice, and that we're going to see a shift back to possibly not necessarily paganism, but that sort of really grassroots spirituality that's really just natural for people.
Yeah, some people use the word animist. It's not quite pagan, but it's this connection to everything, or having the idea that everything has consciousness. And yeah, and you and I have talked, like, that's who is finding their way to me, the people that are already out practicing, being in touch with that. And those are kind of like the leaders of this personal, unique spirituality that you have connection as you see fit, as serves you, without the, here's the only way to do it, or you'll be punished if you, yeah, interesting. And it's interesting too, because one of the benefits of organized religion perhaps was the community services that were provided. And so who takes up that? How do we organize to still, feed people and clothe people, and some of those things that the churches did? I don't have an answer. It's not just we want to chuck every organization out. We're just saying it's changing, just like everything's changing. We're changing. We're growing to a new way of working through it. Yeah.
And maybe if we don't have those institutions, we won't always have these poor or underclasses that constantly need charity too, which I'm kind of wondering if that's what Gen Z is going to be doing, especially because they are more socialist, they are more democratic. And there's the idea, well, maybe we don't actually have to have nots in order to have. And I'm sort of wondering if maybe we are going to once again really be our brother's keeper.
Yeah.
Like we were all intended to be, because that's what humans are.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Any last thing that you'd like to add that's coming to mind now, that, and especially even about the years to come, or just anything that's popping into your mind?
So I think the one thing, and this does come up a lot. It's come up during the pandemic. It's come up afterwards. And while I've been talking to clients, like, you can still have hope. And part of what I love doing as astrologer is helping people figure out, how do they change the world? What do they add to make this good? Because nothing is set in stone. And there's heroes everywhere, and there are people who have a profound spiritual job. And I've met a lot of people who are spiritual warriors, people who are here on earth with a very specific, great mission. And heroes don't rise when there's nothing going on. So the fact that it seems bad now, yes, I mean, the world has actually always been bad. It was probably maybe relatively worse in the Middle Ages, but this is the time for heroism. So if you're feeling scared, this is the time to rise. And chances are you're here for a very specific reason with a very specific purpose. And I can find that in your chart, and I can find out what it is that you can do to help save the world. And the thing is, everybody has it. There's nobody who was just born to take up space.
Right. Everyone's here with a unique contribution. And I find when we are matched with, when we are aligned with our chart and providing our unique contribution to the world, it's also really joyous and satisfying and fulfilling. And we have this sense of being on purpose and on track. So it's kind of win-win for everybody involved that way. Yeah.
When you're happy, when you know what you're doing, it's almost like you can almost be unflappable. Like you can see it, there's smoke and fire here, but you can see that the valley is clear. And, and that's really what I like to do. Because like I said, people don't contact me because everything's fine.
Yeah.
We try to put out fires, but we also try to look and see, where is the grass growing now?
Yeah.
And how do you rise out of the ashes like a phoenix?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, Miriam, thank you so much for your time today. And I will put all of your contact info below in the text in case that changes. We won't have it on recording. But anyway, thank you so much for your time today. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.